Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week we feature interviews with incredible poets, songwriters, and artists, including Alleliah Nuguid, Safia El Hilo, Dana Joya, and many more. We also feature periodic submitted poetry episodes. Visit viewlesswings.com to submit your original poetry. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, and The Plague Doctor. Hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Threads at viewlesswings. Alleliah Nuguid is a Californian poet based in Tucson, Arizona. She holds a PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Utah and an MFA in poetry from Boston University. Her work has been supported by the Vermont Studio Center, Taft-Nicholson Center, and the Jack Kerouac School for Disembodied Poetics, and her poems have most recently appeared in the Slowdown, Hex Literary, and Volume Poetry. Her debut collection, A Human Moon, won the 2022 Dynamo Verlag Book Prize. A Leo Sun and Scorpio Moon, she would love to read your tarot cards. Alleliah, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you so much, James. It's a delight to be here.
Yes, it was so good to meet you at one of my open mics as Poet Laureate of Dublin, California. That was a serendipitous meetup. Well, congratulations on your debut book, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading and rereading. Before diving into the book, what was your journey to becoming published?
Oh, well, it was quite a long journey. The books in this poem took about 8 years to write in total. Essentially, I wrote the earliest poems in this book when I was a student at Boston University getting my MFA. And shortly after that, I entered the PhD program at the University of Utah. So essentially, these poems span the time I was in grad school and a year after.
Wow, so that's consistent with most poets. I think there's very few examples where someone just sort of, a book pours out of them in a year and they're done and it gets selected and published. That is definitely very, 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 very rare. Well, your book opens with Excarnation, which you'll read later, and it's a compelling piece that sets such a macabre and visually striking tone. What was your thought process for choosing this as your opening poem of A Human Moon?
Well, funny enough, Excarnation is the newest poem in the book. Somehow the book did not feel quite complete, even as I was sending it out to contests. And after it was accepted for publication, I wrote Excarnation and thought, wow, there it is. There's the first poem in the book. It needs to be before everything and sort of set the stage.
And I think it does set the stage really effectively for the style of poetry that is this collection. The poem, Interesting Results of Professor Woodworth's Anthropological Studies, wonderful title, is a found poem from a 1903 New York Times article. It's striking because of the nonchalant and impersonal language used to describe the people of another race as though they are mere curiosities. First of all, how did you stumble on this article and then make the leap to constructing a found poem from this article, which worked very well in this case?
Essentially, I was thinking about the sort of purported objectivity of science today and in the past, and considering how what we see as objective now may be seen quite differently later on. So that led me to do some research and see what sort of scientific articles had come out and how they presented their findings as, purely unbiased and in the interest of science, when really there's so much underlying it.
I think that's fascinating that, yes, the objectivity of science will still have infused in it biases, prejudice, cultural norms, all sorts of things that aren't apparent at the time. And at the time, I hadn't really thought about the poem in that way. At the time, would have come across as totally normal and banal. And now, a century later, it's yikes. It's pretty shocking. Yeah, that's interesting that science, as objective as science can be, it's infused with the biases of the time. That's fascinating. The poem Crossing the Bay Bridge opens with the lines, "What curative was that, driving there, driving back, attempting to suppress through repetition?" So this poem uses the word repetition, the rhythm of repetition so effectively, and this continues right through the poem. How do you think about capturing rhythm in a poem?
Well, that is an interesting one because repetition is also built into the subject matter of the poem. It's about a time when I was driving back and forth across the Bay Bridge, essentially moving from one city to another. So, yeah, it did make sense to incorporate repetition into the structure of the poem as well, kind of making the matter or the content of the poem and the form align. And in that poem, there's a lot that is hidden even throughout the repetition. Even in that sentence, what is it that I am attempting to suppress through repetition? There's the object that is obscured, and the repetition helps to further the obscuration of that, whatever it is that is being suppressed.
Yeah, I thought it was I reread it several times, even read it out loud, and especially reading out loud, this repetition, this rhythm, this back and forth just comes through in a way that only poetry, I think, can do so effectively. And was this an example of a poem that you read out loud as part of the editing process to figure out if it was working?
Oh, every single one of these poems I've read out loud, some more than others, but reading out loud is a really critical part of my editing process. I find it so incredibly useful because what feels good in your mouth feels good in the listener's ear, for one. And also, when you read a poem out loud, you can tend more toward natural rhythms and language, and you can see where the language might be a little bit unnatural on the page, and your voice naturally sort of fixes it.
Absolutely. And I think that, and this is something that I've started to do much more recently, and as I started publishing my poetry versus just sharing with friends and family, is absolutely reading out loud as part of the editing process. And it's interesting how reading it out loud in your mind is just not the same. Your brain, skips over things. It doesn't catch issues, but when you externalize it, or another thing that I like to do that a poet recommended is give a draft poem to someone and just have them read it cold and just see where they stumble and where they get tripped up verbally. Yeah. So I think that's important for every poet, is read things out loud. It's amazing what you'll discover. Well, I reread the poem Murder Cabin. Very enticing title. Makes you want to read the poem. I reread the poem Murder Cabin several times. It's a fascinating and strange series of 4 loosely related poems. In the second, you write, "Youth gleams technicolor, spurning horizon. Trunk stocked with bourbon and boxed wine. 2 women, 3 men, draw a pentagram among them." I'm really curious how you constructed this poem, how it began and evolved into its final form.
Yeah, sure. Well, I have always been a huge fan of horror ever since I was a child, and I watched the Chucky movies, which were brutally scary to me at the time, but it was a really intoxicating feeling. And yeah, well, while I was at the University of Utah, I realized that I could turn my lifelong personal interest in horror into an academic interest as well. And there had been some horror themes in my poems, but not super consciously. So then at that time, I did begin to consciously introduce more horror themes. And I wanted to take on the challenge of writing essentially a horror movie poem.
It was really effective. So now to drill down on how you came up with the structure of it. Was it written all at once? I mean, it sort of ties together, but it's also... they stand, each one of the individual poems sort of stands on its own too.
Yeah. So actually, I initially envisioned this as a sequence that would be an entire horror movie. So I thought might as well start at the beginning with the opening credits. So yeah, essentially that is just where I started. I thought about how these movies generally tend to start often with an act of violence, often an act of violence committed against a woman. Thought about how, like, what does it say about these movies that so many of them start in that way? Mm-hmm. And of course, there's been a sort of horror renaissance lately. So a lot of the tropes don't widely apply now as they did before. I'm thinking more sort of classic horror, or I should say horror movies from the 90s and 2000s when I was growing up.
Well, especially like Jordan Peele has like introduced a whole artistic form to the horror genre that almost elevates it in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. The genre has come such a long way. And in that second part of it that you mentioned, road trip, yeah, so generally there is that gender balance in that kind of movie for whatever reason, where it is 3 women and 2 men, and each of them fulfills some sort of archetype. So in this poem, I was trying to look at what is being said without being explicitly said.
Mm-hmm. Well, The Window and the Mirror could be considered a study in enjambment, with lines of varying lengths and line breaks in unexpected places, as though you are intentionally trying to throw the reader off balance. How do you approach line breaks as a tool for capturing the essence, rhythm, the sounds of the structure of the poem?
That's such a great question, and it so varies from poem to poem. And in that one, The Window and the Mirror, I do see more as a sort of with an undercurrent of pain throughout it, more than in other poems. And so the line breaks in it are quite unnatural, stilted, intended to disorient.
Yeah, I thought it was very effective in doing that. And when you translate a poem like that from the page to how you recite it, how does the poem change? I think poems have, as I've talked about in multiple episodes of this podcast, they take on 3 lives. There's the written form of it, there's the audible form of it, where you don't see the poet, and then there's actually seeing the poet perform it. And there's I think those 3 things are sort of different in their own way. But taking a poem like that, where it's intentionally jagged and intended to be disruptive, when you read it, how much of your recited version tries to match that visual form?
That's a great question. I've never thought about it consciously like that, really. I suppose there's always a reason in the first place why the lines are broken as they are, and that must transfer over to the voice somehow. With my poem At the Mall, which I will be reading later, the line breaks are sort of similar to those in The Window and the Mirror, also intended to disorient. I don't know. I think maybe you'll have to tell me how those line breaks are reflected in the reading. I've never really thought about it in that way.
Yeah, no, there was another poet I spoke to last year who wrote a poem where there was a piece in the middle and then it was surrounded with commentary. And in its pure form on the page, you just couldn't read it. It would be you'd be so confused as a listener. So when he recited it for a video on YouTube, he just read the middle portion. And then the kind of the commentary around the poem visually on the page, that was only in the written form. I think another example is I wrote a concrete poem that was in the form of sort of a Zen, sort of going in and out. And I try to reflect that rhythm, but some of the lines are so short that if I literally added space for some of these line breaks visually, it would just be very strange to listen to. So I tried to instead capture this in and out sort of Zen-y rhythm. So I do think some poems, the poem on the page is stage direction. And in another case, you have to reimagine it a little bit for audio. It's fascinating. I do think it's I recommend anyone who loves a book of poetry that also has an audiobook, go and buy the audiobook. Olivia Gatwood's book, Life of the Party. I interviewed her a few years ago. That's a perfect example. Like, you really want to have the audiobook and the physical book and to complement each other. Well, in the poem World Made of Sugar, the page turn is literally at the turn of the poem, amplifying the moment. You write, "In California, lollipop palms lolling their dull heads windward, you told me you were dying." and the page turn is just before you were dying. My assumption with poetry is that everything is intentional. How do you approach how your poems appear not just on the page, but on the pages of a book layout where design can be a constraint and both a constraint and an opportunity?
Yeah, it's been an interesting process with the poems in this book and working with my wonderful publisher, Dynamo Verlag. Yeah, so when I wrote this manuscript, I had no idea what sort of book it would eventually become. And Dynamo Verlag exclusively publishes 5x7 books, so they're smaller than the usual book. And as a consequence, it's had some interesting effects on the poems. A couple of the poems in there, the lines had to be significantly changed because they were more spread out across the page, and it simply wouldn't work with this design. So with World Made of Sugar, it was unintentional, but it worked out so well.
Well, that was a serendipitous accident then, because as I was turned the page, it was so unexpected. I think in Stephen King's book, The Shining, when I first read it, I think the discovery that the word red room was actually murder spelled backwards, which I didn't realize until I turned the page, and there it was, and it almost made me jolt. So yes, I think sometimes there can be happy accidents, and other times, to the extent you have control as an author on the book layout, you can create those happy accidents. So that worked really well. It's interesting that was just a happy accident. And in the poem, "Oh Rubber Glove," it's a wonderful example of a short poem, a series of questions beautifully capturing what a symbol image would be if described in prose. You write, "What forms have you known before fleeing across the interstate, tumbleweed freed from decision? Into what coarse shapes have they seduced you under the sun's gravel scrape? What corrosive sweetness have you witnessed withholding judgment, lacking a mouth?" I think this to me at least seems like one of these poems that you were out in the world and you saw something and you stopped and thought, oh, there's a poem in there. And maybe describe like the moment where you were inspired by this poem and then how you took this inspiration and turned it into a piece of poetry. And I ask that because I've had the same thing where I'm walking along and I pause and I take a note and I go, oh, there's a poem there.
Certainly, yes. This poem was exactly that. Driving across the interstate and seeing this rubber glove and thinking about the life it has lived, the life it will live, what it has seen, essentially, who it has known through the intimacy of having a hand, essentially, wear it. Yeah, and just thinking about its context that I will never know.
I think that's a great example of how poetry can bring to life even the simplest, smallest thing, that if it were prose, maybe you could create something out of it, but it would be much harder. It's just prose doesn't lend itself to expanding on such a small little starting point. So yes, I completely visualized. I assumed you were driving somewhere and you just saw it and then you realized there's a poem there. Well, now I'm going to turn the mic over to you to read a few selections from A Human Moon.
So this first poem that I will recite is about some of the horrors of puberty, and it is called At the Mall. A piercing machine aimed by a teen at the small of the still healing lobe barely misses, punctures air instead. I take my best friend's safety pinned wrist and pull her toward the crush of bodies, body sprays, sprays of forget-me-nots. She cartwheels into the current with the gymnast grace which will later fail her once and never again, but for now initiates us into the food court where our boyfriend is waiting, saving our seats. He asks me to marry him and I decline. He asks and asks, cashing delicious refusal. We spend all Sunday this way. Barbie's dream home invasion. I check the locks, chain link slid into position, deadbolt bolted. The shackle on my perfect ankle still rattling. Plastic turkey forever ready in the oven, waiting to be admired. But as I yearn my mitted hand toward it, I am compelled to turn again. The door, ajar, my work undone. Wind hisses and snakes an invisible hand beneath my apron. I chain, bolt, shackle again, smooth my blonde locks. I nearly settle into my seat, and then the window, it gapes fully open. Inside dissolves into outside, and the essence of my signature scent, sugar cookies and gasoline, gets sucked into the night, beckoning a horde of hooligans. Though I am famed for my figure and composure, both crumble as I sink into the tile, my smile distended into silent sobs. Only from the floor can I see that my house is missing a wall. It was not damaged, but built this way by design. The table for two, the hot pink vanity, the gauzy canopy veiling my sleep, all of it belonging to everyone but me. Shackle, bolt, chain. For the record, I wrote that poem before I was aware of the Barbie movie, long before it came out. And I see the poem and the film as side-by-side additions to the Barbie mythos. The last poem that I'm going to share is called Excarnation, which refers to the burial practice of leaving remains outside to be ravaged by elements and scavenged by critters. So there are ancient religions and what is now modern day Turkey who believed that the vulture, through performing excarnation, carried the soul to the deity to be judged. And it seems to me that there's a possible connection between this myth of the vulture and the myth of the stork, which brings babies earthward from heaven, perhaps in a reincarnated form. Excarnation. In the vulture's domain, I am native to death. Every backward step home, I bore my body, which clutched in turn the season's fashion. Now it is time to serve myself up as hors d'oeuvre on a plateau platter, garnished with carnage. I've eaten, lords. No, I've gorged on provisions of unknown provenance. I've gourmandized without asking how or why or whom I fed upon. Nor have I considered the vulture and what must pass through her gullet for her to pass judgment. My form holds light as fingers laced and waits. She pecks politely at my flesh, slightly masking her distaste at what she finds, what I no longer hide. Bald head rouged with blood, she emerges with a verdict, surges skyward, abandoning my bones to calcine in the sun. Bird of paradise, bird of prey, she will bear me back again one day, swathed in pearly linen, partially forgiven.
Always so wonderful hearing poetry read by the poet. I've thoroughly enjoyed that, as I always do this section of the interviews. Well, the poem Barbie's Dream Home Invasion, in addition to being very timely, unexpectedly, it's such a wonderfully evocative title for a poem. How do you approach titling your poems, which can be really hard for a lot of poets?
Funny enough, for this one, the title came first. I've always been interested in home invasion as a theme in horror movies, and a one-time fear of mine. I'm not so afraid of it now, but I'm not sure exactly how it happened. Somehow the two things were coexisting in my mind at the same time, Barbie and home invasions. And I thought, what if Barbie is actually afraid of her dream house being home invaded? And it made sense to me that she would be in the position that she is.
Yeah, especially with the home not really having four walls. It has no security system. It's wide open, or it opens on a hinge. Exactly. It just, yeah, I thought it was such a wonderful, once you have that idea, then I know I've had a couple of those times where I have this idea and then the poem is just this exciting exploration. And then other times I've got this sort of images and I'm not even sure what the heck it is. And I had to figure out what it is afterwards. I think similar to that, I had this idea, I think through a dream, of going into an art gallery, and every gallery I went into started to dissolve into the floor. And I thought, well, that's really cool. Why don't I go into like a library, museum-ish thing, and then a sculpture and paintings, and it all just melts into the floor. And then I had to figure out, well, what is this poem really about? But yeah, that this poem reminded me of that, especially with you saying that it was that just the concept came to you first, and then you had to fill it in with a poem. Well, finally, what are you working on now?
Well, right now I am, I'm on a road trip that I've been on for the past 5 months, ever since Labor Day. Once my book got published, I quit my job and embarked from Tucson, Arizona, and I've been to most parts of the country at this point. Currently, I'm in Lawrence, Kansas. And on this road trip, I have been going to open mics such as yours, and sharing poems from the book, while also working on my second book, which is a long narrative poem in accentual rhyming quatrains after an old tale. So it's very different from the poems in my first book, which are quite short and not so hewn to a particular meter or form. So it's been a really exciting project. I'm also working on an audiobook. Funny enough that we were talking about audiobooks earlier. I'm working on an audiobook version of A Human Moon.
Congratulations. Well, it must be very exciting traveling the country and exploring. And is this all lined up ahead of time, or are you sort of impromptu, just finding your path as you go and finding opportunities as you go along?
Yeah, it's very impromptu. There are some events here and there, readings that are anchored on in particular locations, but in between them, it's very much sort of where the energy is, where it feels right to go. So,
that's
very
really
impromptu.
Really exciting. Yes, I wish I had more opportunity to get across the country to share my poetry. My day job definitely makes that very challenging. So cool on you for taking that leap of faith and doing that. That's really neat. Well, Alleliah, thank you so much for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you so much, James.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at Viewless Wings. Hit subscribe to be notified of every episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and spread the word with your poetry community.